Welcome. I am here with Dr. Michael Westerman. He is a member of SEPI, a theorist, a therapist, and somebody who I've had a number of conversations with. I gave a talk not too long ago, and I was hoping to have an opportunity for discussing, but it never really manifested that way. There's some confusion about time. That was at the annual SEPI conference. We're having an opportunity here to discuss that talk a little. Hey, Michael. Thanks so much for coming along and chatting with me.
My pleasure, Greg. I'm grateful to you to have this opportunity. So take it away.
All right. So what we agreed on is we will put in the connection. I will put this up on my YouTube channel, the Unified Theory of Knowledge channel. We'll make a link, which is already on the SEPI page, to my presidential address. We can't presume that people have watched that whole thing. If they are interested in it, they can follow that link. So what seems to be reasonable is for me to give a 10-minute overview of the key points of that talk, just to orient folks who are interested in this, in case they didn't see it, or it's now been a couple of months, to help them remind themselves what it is that I might have covered.
Greg, should I introduce myself before or after you give that overview?
Actually, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself now? It'd be good to get the iterative interpersonal flow together so we can coordinate our activities and defenses.
Okay, all right. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at NYU. Interested and involved in interpersonal approaches to psychopathology and psychotherapy. I've developed a theory about interpersonal defenses, and I'm involved in investigations exploring the implications of that theory for psychotherapy. I should also mention, as just one more point, that I also have active interests in philosophical psychology, which include the nature of theories in psychology, and the nature of the person and the person's relationship to events and other people.
Lovely.
So all of those things are...
I remember attending one of your philosophical psychological talks, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I'm not sure if it was at Division 24 or what, but I distinctly remember that you laid out some really fascinating points. I recall that.
Thank you. Thanks.
So, okay. So yeah, maybe we'll dive. So we're both clinicians and we're both theorists, so we should have some good things to talk about. So yes, I am president of currently of the Society for Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration, SEPI. We organized a conference this year. It was split, a hybrid conference. And as a function of my role as president, I gave a presidential address. That presidential address was based on a theme that I crafted in concert, mostly with Marv Goldfried, the co-founder of SEPI, especially from a CBT angle, and also Jeffrey Smith, who has been sort of advocating for a more generic core view of psychotherapy. The theme is toward a common core. It's a play off of common factors, but attempts to build off of somewhat of what Marv Goldfried has emphasized in terms of finding a common set of agreements, and what Jeffrey Smith has articulated, and what emerges from my unified view. So it was toward a common core. We had a series of webinars, 2 different webinars, one with Mike Mascolo and then the other sort of summarizing that, where we delineated what we could agree at least to be a psychotherapeutic common core in the form of the kinds of problems that are at the heart of psychotherapy, the kinds of mechanisms at sort of a base science level that we're studying, both kind of psychological, interpersonal, and neurobiological, the processes of psychotherapy that are at the heart of the process, and the core principles that frame the work. And so my talk started there, and it summarized some of the findings of our discussion. It summarized some of Marv's work in relationship to that. And basically it said, hey, psychotherapy should be oriented primarily towards addressing entrenched maladaptive problems, or clinically significant maladaptive problems, whereby a maladaptive problem is an individual who comes into a particular types of situation that they're trying to adjust to. And then the processes of that adjustment tend to create more problems than they solve. That traps them a bit. And then that spreads so that they then find themselves in a disordered relationship, say, with themselves and the environment. Sometimes I'll talk about the agent arena relationship. That's from my friend John Vervaeke and 4E Cognitive Science. But basically, it's an unhealthy, problematic pattern that is somewhat self-reinforcing and then difficult to extricate oneself from. And this can be framed in terms of relational conflicts, self-esteem, anxiety and depression. And what I would certainly say sort of is at the heart of the predominant themes in psychotherapy, the internalizing neurotic conditions. In terms of the fundamental mechanisms, Jeffrey Smith advocated for sort of a behavioral neuroscience view to ground some of the core learning mechanisms that have been revealed in terms of the processes by which the nervous system adapts and adjusts, issues of long-term potentiation, how to afford arousal that then results in re-narration and re-relation to old traumas and injuries and emotions, how we learn in relationship to some of that. So those are some of the mechanisms. I'm not going to, because I'm giving just a summary, I'm not getting into any of the details. Then there was a set of processes, change processes and relationship processes. Marv Goldfried had sort of a stepwise unfolding of process where you're unconsciously incompetent, then you're consciously incompetent, then you're consciously competent, and then ultimately unconsciously competent as you've learned and internalized. It's kind of a stage of change model that's actually, I think, useful in the psychotherapy world for a clinician and the therapist. And then ultimately, there's core principles associated with instilling hope, elements in relationship to how we deal with the relationship and cultivate a particular sense of honoring the client, issues in relationship to kind of what are our core values. So that structure, the common core then was really designed to elaborate on common factors, give it a lot richer frame, but also say, yes, this is sort of this has enough substance for the epicenter of psychotherapy to really cut across the schools and define the process across these issues of problems, mechanisms, processes, and principles. I then move from that, and because I come at this from a theoretical perspective, a meta-theoretical and philosophical perspective that is concerned, long time concerned with the problem of psychotherapy, its fragmentation, the philosophical and meta-theoretical issues that the field faces and can't seem to resolve. People who know me know I developed then this unified theory of psychology. It grows into a unified theory of knowledge, UTOK, and it's a meta-psychological frame that says, hey, actually, there is a way to get in right relation, matter and mind, as it were, science and social and subjective knowledge, and create a coherent, conciliant framework of understanding. That applied to psychotherapy gives rise to a new view approaching unification, whereby the unified view, and me and my colleagues interested in unification, I just published on this, is a meta-theoretical perspective, which we identified in terms of the metaphor of looking at the different perspectives inside of psychotherapy as different mountains, as it were, mountains of understanding, the paradigms or schools of thought. You'd enter there, you'd learn that language. Psychotherapy integration was really a dialogue between these mountains. Unification is a different approach to thinking about integration that zooms out and uses foundational meta-theoretical constructs, philosophical constructs to see if you can coherently see the whole. The metaphor we use is going from the mountains to seeing the landscape, the mountain range, as it were. And we believe that there are a couple of pathways that afford a pretty clear holistic view. And although at first they seem somewhat discordant and difficult to organize, we had a couple of summits, those of us that worked on this paper, and came to the conclusion that there were epistemological, kind of ontological, and systems views that afforded ways to see the mountain range and complementary. That set me up to then say, hey, let's think about integration from a three-tiered view of a common core, that's the problems, mechanisms, principles, and processes, and then this different schools of thought and the psychotherapy integration movement being the dialogue between those schools of thought, and then a third, most abstract, zoomed out view, a view of the landscape. And my argument is that three-tiered view affords another way of framing psychotherapy integration that might be productive, might address some longstanding issues and move the field forward. Following that, I basically argued that the unified theory into the unified approach that's part of the UTOC system affords pretty clear models for being optimistic that this is a productive enterprise. I ended up describing three different domains, one at the level of character functioning, which I developed, which argued that actually the human mental system is fruitfully divided up into 5 systems of adaptation. This is akin to thinking of your body in terms of all sorts of different organ systems. I argue that actually our psychological systems can be thought of in the way we adjust into the environment as 5 different mental systems or character adaptation systems: the habit procedural system, the experiential operant system, the relationship system, the defense system, and the justification system. These are 5 different systems of adaptation. And I use that lens to argue that the individual approaches to psychotherapy have actually focused on processes of adaptation. For example, the behavioral approach basically focuses on a habitual adjustment process to environmental stimuli and contingency. And then it sees what kinds of maladaptive processes evolve from particular patterns of stimulus response or contingency or et cetera, and then develops behavioral modification structures to undo the maladaptive cycles and replace them with more adaptive processes. I argued that emotion-focused therapy focuses on the experiential emotional system. Psychodynamic perspectives focus on relational and defensive systems, and cognitive and existential systems tend to focus on the propositional, justificatory, self-reflective narrative portion of our systems of adaptation. That's relevant because what it means is actually the psychotherapies have indeed focused on maladaptive process, but they've latched onto simply a part of the elephant, as it were, from Blind Men and the Elephant. They grab a part of the mental system. They do focus on maladaptive, but they come at it through a particular lens that is actually limiting relative to the entire system. Cass says that actually, if we start with these different systems of adaptation, we can glean the key insights and we can place them in relationship to adaptive and maladaptive processes. So that connects back to the kinds of problems that psychotherapy deals with: character maladaptive adjustment that arises out of the iterative process of different systems of adaptation. And then I delineated the key process by which we get trapped in terms of triple negative neurotic loops. A triple negative neurotic loop has, as the name suggests, 3 different negatives. There are negative situations, okay, that are valence to, oh no, this is a bad thing. My girlfriend broke up with me. I lost my job. I can't get what I want in the world. Those are negative situations. You can have negative ideas also. And those things then trigger negative feelings. Feelings are emotional, emotive responses that energize you, tell you what you are and your goals, and then say this is bad, and then to try to orient you to do certain things. And then what happens to people in relationship to both of these negative valences is very often they develop negative reactions to the negative feeling, situation, relation. And here negative, if it's ever applicable to the situation we're thinking about, is a negative maladaptive reaction. This goes back to what I was saying about the kinds of maladaptive problems. In other words, the way you might avoid, you might blame yourself or others, you might try to inadvertently control or ineffectually control. And this feeds back on the problem. I call those the ABCs now of the negative reactions: avoidance, blaming, control. And then finally, well, how do we reverse these? The unified theory says actually, you want to bring intrapsychically and interpersonally, bring a mindful approach, which means you become aware rather than mindlessly reacting. You become mindfully responsive. You become aware and accepting of the situation from a metacognitive observer view. That's the MO in COM-MO. The metacognitive observer also means modus operandi. And then it delineates the attitude that you want to cultivate in these negative reaction systems as being calm, as a general. And then it's an acronym that says if we can cultivate the attitude of curiosity, also openness, wonderment, etc., acceptance, capacity to stress tolerance, capacity to be present, capacity not to resist the world as it is and your feelings as they are, loving compassion towards self and others instead of blame and criticism, and then a healthy motivation towards valued states of being in the short term, like how do you want to close this scene? What's the best you can get out of it? And long term, what are the arc of values that you want to participate in and the values, meaning, and purpose structure of your life? And the argument then is that COM-MO consolidates a lot of key insights into sort of a readily usable package, and the application of COM-MO on these negative reactions is a way to put a bomb, as it were, on this negative feedback loop and reverse it and afford a healthier way of being. And that's when I brought it to a close. I know I went just a little over our 10 minutes there, but those are certainly the main points.
Okay. Gregg, I think that was a remarkably effective summary of what I think originally was an hour talk.
Mm-hmm.
And so thank you, because it gives a groundwork or a starting point for discussion. In my comments, as best as I can follow things through, if at any point I refer to a part of your talk that you didn't just mention, which I don't think will happen very often because you covered so much of it, but then I'll just note what I'm referring to. And so that,
yes, and I'll be happy to share slides if it feels useful. I'm set up to do that for us.
Right. Great. Okay. So let me say that your project, Gregg, is an ambitious one. This idea of putting together a new approach to psychotherapy integration. My view certainly is that it includes a number of really interesting and useful ideas.
Thank you.
I do have questions, though, about it. And
as any thinking person should.
So my first question is a very general one, and it's lengthy.
Okay.
So it's gonna take me a few minutes to articulate it. Please, everyone, certainly including you, Gregg, bear with me. Okay. But I promise that my subsequent questions will be more succinct.
Lovely. All right.
So
I'm prepared to take notes as need be, Michael. So let her rip.
Okay, so here comes. So the question really is about the nature of your approach, and I'd like to get more clear on what the approach is trying to do. Mm-hmm. So when I think of the terms common core and unified, the latter term, unified, suggests to me bringing the diverse efforts in the field together in a single framework. And the term common core suggests to me something quite similar, just a little bit different, identifying basic ideas that all approaches share. Those are at least the connotations that those terms have totally. For me.
That's reasonable.
As I see it, there are far-reaching challenges to efforts of this kind, to do this kind of integration, but possibly some real benefits. So I want to make 2 points about what I see as points of challenge. The first is, insofar as what you're doing it involves identifying very general notions that many positions hold in common. The risk here, I'm just saying this in general.
Of course, yeah, no, proceed. These are, I'm following your critique, definitely, so proceed,
yeah, yes. Okay, the risk here is that you'll come up with general ideas that don't say that much, yep. Because they're so general. Just to give a really simplistic example is, if we put forward as a common core idea, psychotherapy is trying to help people with psychological problems, that we might well get 97% of psychologists on board with that, but we also haven't really said much.
Agreed.
But there is a possibility that they can be helpful. And as an example, which you actually referred to in your full talk, that I can point to as an effort that kind of splits this difference between being too general that it's vague, and on the other hand, saying something that really is useful. I would point to Marv Goldfried's and Catherine Eubanks' principles of change idea. And if you would show slide 8, please.
Certainly. Make sure I'm on the right one.
8. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a version of those principles of change that they put forward. So you're fostering the patient's help, facilitating the alliance, increasing awareness of why the patient is having difficulties, encourage corrective experiences, and emphasize reality testing. So regarding this framework, which is just a small piece of your ideas, Gregg, I think we can raise questions about it. I have some questions about the particular points. I know that Marv and Catherine are completely open to the idea that maybe there's a 6th, a 7th, who knows, an 8th principle that one might want to add. But I think it's useful because these general ideas lead us to ask helpful questions. And if I remember correctly, what I just said about helpful questions is a point that Paul Wachtel made on the list, SEPI listserv some time ago, maybe about half a year ago. So for example, if we accept the idea that corrective experiences are a key feature, which in fact I do accept, this opens up big but useful questions like, how should we go about thinking what would be a corrective experience for a given patient at a given point in time in treatment? And what would be a good way to actually provide that experience? There are other questions that one could enumerate about that idea, which is, let's see, it's idea 4. But these 2 questions already are themselves very big questions. And so they show how point 4 points us in a useful direction. But I would say because it's asking a really good question. And so we're getting somewhere with these 5 points, for sure. Okay. Then the second way that we might proceed is to develop what might be called a more substantive or specified framework. So this offers more specific guidance, but it runs the danger, or the risk, of not being inclusive, because it'll take certain elements from certain approaches, and it'll leave some psychologists disagreeing. Well, what about this idea which you really haven't incorporated? And so as an example of a very effective approach along these lines, as I see it, would be Paul Wachtel's cyclical psychodynamics. I think it's a very, very useful approach, but unquestionably, some people would disagree, or at least not find it especially valuable, because it's primarily drawing from 2 therapeutic traditions, and picking out certain points, but not others from those 2 traditions. Okay, so now after this long introduction, I come to my first question. Gregg, I think that you're trying to offer something like the first approach, but that there are some elements like what I called the first approach, but I think that in many respects, your model, your framework is an example of the second approach. Although, as compared to, say, Paul's cyclical psychodynamics, it's certainly more wide-ranging in several respects than most efforts at theoretical integration. So is what you're trying to do the first kind of thing I said, and or the second kind of thing, or are you trying to do something really different from either?
Right. Great question. I think the short answer to that can be found in the layers that I laid out. And that is that the common core aspect is very much an advance on common factors, which is definitely what is our folk psychological shared understanding of the core principles in Marv Goldfried's What Can We Agree language. Can we generate useful everyday psychological descriptions like, okay, well, corrective emotional experience, it's every day for us as therapists. How do you facilitate motivation and hope, etc. So the first common core effort is to essentially separate out common factors as a different kind of thing and advance common factors to be more sophisticated as it sits exactly in this kind of setting of, hey, how do we elucidate the center through a common language structure? And can we do that more richly, asking better questions that bring different perspectives together, see underlying commonalities, and also, in terms of Jeffrey Smith, train psychotherapy rather than having training psychotherapy? It's a good question. Should we train psychotherapy across the schools, or should you enter into psychotherapy, through a particular shared portal and then get specialized? I don't know that we know the answer. We definitely train in different ways depending on the school. Certainly the general felt sense is that we could do better than common factors, although common factors was an advance, and we can do better than that in developing common language structures that lead to good descriptions, that lead to interesting questions, but they are not theoretically sophisticated. Okay, meaning what I mean by that is the language that is being used by definition is employing folk psychological language, okay, that is not refined in relationship to its ontology and epistemology. It is common language gaming that we utilize to be Pearsons in the world, and we use belief, desire, action psychology to say, oh, you did what you did because you believe and you desire, and we all get along as persons in the world based on belief, desire psychology, but belief, desire psychology is not grounded in a profound understanding of the universe from a scientific perspective. Okay, it sits at a particular level. So then what you do is you have more refined schools of thought that argue that they have at least entry points into truths that underlie, get at things that are missing, like belief, desire psychology is not really keen on unconscious process. It's like people can sort of talk about it, but for a long time before Freud, the whole idea of the unconscious is not really well elaborated, at least in many cultures. Okay. And so now you have a set of insights that says, well, where do these belief desires come from? Oh, there's a whole thing called unconscious mental process. Well, that opens up, oh my gosh, all of these processes that we call belief desire are at least intimately tied to brain function from a neuroscience biophysiology view. Oh my gosh, there's evolutionary perspectives. Oh my gosh, you are shaped by the consequences and associations of your actions in relation to the behavioral perspective. So we get scientific refinement on those issues. And that's what then gives rise to the schools of thought, which are combinations of scientific refinement generally, coupled to gurus, at least in the context of psychotherapy, who are skilled at one particular mode of doing, and then they develop a system of psychotherapy that becomes iconic. Beckian cognitive therapy versus Ellis, REBT, or Freudian into psychodynamic, etc., as you know. So you get this variation of schools of understanding that afford some refinement that is missed in everyday language. And then you get individuals leading particular types of psychotherapy. And then you get the problem of psychotherapy integration, which I stumbled on 10 years after it was really becoming a thing in the early 1990s. So then I entered the world and said, well, why are these different schools of thought, each of which have key insights, as far as I'm concerned, that speak to the truth of the situation, at least from their particular point of view, that carry some validity? why isn't there an overarching perspective? If each of these is like an instrument playing a tune that says, hey, I see logic in the patterning of this particular perspective, why isn't there a orchestrating system that takes all the instruments together and puts it inside of an overarching meta theoretical framework that allows them to sing in relationship to each other, to create music, rather than different language systems that have different insights that actually are situated in systems of understanding that genuinely compete. Obviously, a Skinnerian radical behavioral view is situated in an epistemological structure, a language game structure that's fundamentally different than cognitive psychotherapy. And you can't really blend those two together in a way that gets music in and of themselves. And yet operant theory and the concept of behavioral selection and the way in which we attribute, explain, justify our particular actions, in my opinion, both have crucial insights. So what I am doing initially was trying to think about a theoretical integration enterprise that was somewhat similar to Paul Wachtel. That's what my inclination was to do. But I took a totally different angle on it, and then I ended up doing something totally different than has been done before. And that's what's weird about Utah. Okay, so it's a different kind. It's not really a theoretical integration straight up. Okay, what I did then was I was like, well, if all the psychotherapies are attempting to situate their insights on something we call psychology, okay, and the methods of science afford us the best epistemologically justified frames of reference, then psychotherapies should be psychological therapies grounded in the concept of psychology. Okay. And so I shifted my attention theoretically from the problem of psychotherapy into what I then came to call the problem of psychology. So the problem of psychology, as I've said in many times, what I sort of knew and then rediscovered from this new angle is that nobody knows what the F psychology is. There fundamentally is no, so you say, oh, well, we're going to do psychological things and people will nod. And I will tell you right away that actually, if you know the history of the field as a theorist, you know that different schools of thought started to try to define what this was, this field, and they never succeeded. All that you had was competition between different schools. Lev Vygotsky, as early as 1927, calls it the crisis, meaning that behavior, stimulus, response, unconscious mental process, mental life functionally defined by James, structurally defined by Wundt and Titchener, and a whole host of other approaches are not the same phenomena in the world. They use mental or even behavioral to reference totally different things in the world. And then what happens is we get a weak conglomerate, Skinner splits off, and we get a weak conglomerate that sort of agrees that the nervous system is a weak information, or weakly agrees that the nervous system is an information processing system with the cognitive revolution. And then what we as psychologists do, the psychological science, is identified and defined by the epistemology of science, meaning that they apply the behavioral science methodology to see behaviors, measure them, and then infer mental processes and build models of mental processes that are the underlying causal structures of the relationships of the data that we engage in. Okay. That is mainstream academic psychology. Look it up. It's the science of behavior and mental process, where behavior is what organisms do. They first say that, and then what you can observe, which is actually two totally different things. And then they say, well, we infer mental process and we apply the methods of science, that's instead of folk psychology, to delineate empirical relations. But if you ask people, what does psychology refer to in the world? There's completely different conceptions. I mean, some people think psychology refers to all animal behavior. Okay. Some people think it refers to the subjective conscious experience of being, the insight psyche that somehow we're going to do science on. Some people believe it refers only to human behavior at the individual and small group level. Okay, so mental processes for people in the vocabulary have completely different references in the world. There are neurocognitive functional reference. There are subjective conscious experience reference. There are justificatory Cartesian reference for what mind is. And so what you have inside of our science, unlike biology, chemistry, and physics, you have a completely broken system that has no ontology. There's no shared ontology inside the science. And so because of that structure, the people that are doing therapy that have their applied practice, they're going to build some variant of insight, of science, of brilliance from a particular guru, of a particular set of practices, and they will generate a school of thought, many of which, of course, the psychodynamic, behavioral, cognitive, humanistic, and systems traditions are unbelievably rich now and we've learned a huge amount from them. But they're essentially clueless. I mean, from a unified theory perspective, they're essentially clueless at the level that they obviously fail at the level of coherence. There is no ontology here. So what is clued in? Well, biology is clued in. Biology is the science of life. Biological scientists understand that natural selection, genetics, and cells are key ingredients. We understand what living processes are. We can study them. We can debate about whether viruses are alive, but nobody debates about what the ontological referent is for biology. Well, you get into psychology, and it's a completely different thing. So the science itself is actually completely incoherent. And that is why we're going to then have therapies that are fundamentally confused, because there's no grounding in a scientific system. As a function of that, you get people with different insights, humanistic organismic valuing process, unconscious motivation, behavioral reinforcement, whatever. And the unified theory then asked this question, and then it was like, oh, I had a couple of key insights that were transformative, that were missing from the entire landscape of knowledge. And those key insights then upgraded my understanding and transformed the incoherence in the jump from biology to psychology to the social sciences to a coherent picture of that narrative from a big picture scientific view. And so now I understood what the mental was. I understood what human persons were. I understood those were very different things, by the way. And I understood how to interrelate them. And I built an architecture, the unified theory, through a couple of 4 key insights. That's on this tree of life thing back here, the tree of knowledge, justification, systems theory, behavioral investment system, and the influence matrix. And this is totally new theoretical architecture that then assimilates and integrates all the schools of thought. So it's not a theoretically integrated project. Paul situates himself in relationship to psychodynamic theory and behavioral theory. I situate myself basically into a cosmic evolutionary view, and then generated the proper ontology and descriptive metaphysics of a cosmic evolutionary view, came inside of that, built that, and then came back to the schools of thought to create music out of the instruments that each school was playing.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Actually, well, I mean, we could, without doubt, spend the rest of the time today just going back and forth, with, I would have some questions of clarification about what you said and the like.
Of course.
But actually, a number of the questions that I've set down to ask you will do that.
Lovely.
In the course of.
Let's proceed then on that round.
Sort of just being questions on their own. So from my next question, would you please put up slide 6?
Mm-hmm. Is this the mechanism slide? Let me see.
No.
Hold on. I'll make sure I'm on the right one. Yeah. Well, this is slide 6 as it is.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes, yeah. So Gregg, as you said at the outset today, this is one of the 4 key parts of the approach, mechanisms. Mm-hmm. And my question picks up quite directly on some of the things you were just saying, because for those of you viewing, if you'd spend a minute reading through the slide, you'll see that there are, I think, I mean, if you have a similar take to my take, that there are some interesting observations or interesting mechanisms identified. And if you look at the very last 2 lines in the slide, they refer to foundational research in psychological science. And so these are ideas that have come from what Gregg's calling foundational research in psychological science, and which you were talking about as being really an important place to stand on in developing the whole overall framework. my question is that when I think about mechanisms, well, in my training and what got left out of it, I don't typically think about these things, but I certainly find them interesting. But I think about some other things, and I wonder why you're not including them. What you said just before gives me some idea, but I think it'd be helpful for me to ask. So, for example, and these are just examples, I could come up with lots more. What about Bill Stiles' assimilation theory, who argues that the problem that many people who come to psychotherapy are dealing with are problems in incompatibility between what he calls different voices and what he calls a dialogical viewpoint, and that the mechanism of change involves helping people integrate those voices.
Lovely.
Typically two main voices. Okay, one idea I find very, very interesting. Then in interpersonal reconstructive therapy, which has been developed by Lorna Benjamin and Ken Critchfield, you have a bunch of notions about mechanisms. I'll just mention one right now, the gift of love, which is a way to understand why people repeat problematic interpersonal patterns from earlier in their lives. And also, they would argue, gives a basis for a mechanism of change. And then just as one more example, you have emotion-focused therapy and the notion of primary and secondary emotions and how they play key roles in people's problems as viewed from the EFT perspective, but also that when you think about things in that way, you get ideas about what would be helpful for people in therapy. So again, those are just particular examples, but why not include them on the list as well as, others of their ilk?
Totally. So just there's certainly, this is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of just like Lamar's list of 5. I wouldn't want to restrict problems only to maladaptive patterns, although I think that's a good spot, and certainly mechanisms. Okay, so let's understand the history of this particular angle, this Jeffrey Smith's angle. He's a psychiatrist, and then comes from a particular biological not that he's a reductionist per se, but he's then anchored to a particular kind of meaning of the word mechanism that is a bit more on the biologically reductive side. And he's hooking up with Richard Lane and others that are doing particular alignment with therapeutic change, emotional change, narrative change, and brain change. And the argument was that, well, if we look at what we know about the brain, we can elucidate certain foundational brain experience relations. And those brain experience relations do tell us that a corrective emotional experience may have these particular kinds of ingredients from the bottom up. The word mechanism is a very, very complicated word. That was a little while ago. I got involved in the philosophy of mechanism, and read like 9 papers on what mechanism actually meant philosophically. It means a lot of things as we get into this. So for me, what this is a placeholder. It's a placeholder for 2 things. It's a placeholder for, Jeffrey Smith's line that says, hey, I think there's real grounding behavioral neuroscience, cognitive behavioral neuroscience that affords a particular angle that we can integrate nicely in what psychotherapy does and elucidate core change processes in a way that maps on with good neuroplasticity models and gives us a coherent and specifies that, hey, psychotherapy may actually, we may be able to ground this in a biophysiological change mechanism. So that's what I see that as. Then the issue is, is that the only mechanism? certainly for me, I am no physical reductionist by any stretch. I do not think of the ontology, the real world, as being just properly construed as physical material process. The tree of knowledge defines sort of our ontology in terms of an unfolding wave of complexification, and systems operate at different levels and dimensions of analysis. And what we have not gotten right is exactly how to specify the psychological, mental, and the cultural person levels of analysis relative to life and matter. And that's a problem. That's where you get an incoherence of psychological science. But certainly the unified theory is very supportive. If we were to upgrade our understanding of psychological science, have it cohere, our cognitive mentation concepts, our interpersonal concepts, our fundamental understanding of sort of the human nature as it is constituted in a way that we all share as a function of being primates that are then prepared to be socialized. If we specify those kinds of elements and delineate them, we will absolutely be able to generate much richer sets of narratives about mechanism, some of which will be couched in the language of interpersonal process, some of which would be couched in the language of cognitive schematics, some of which would be couched in the language of neurophysiology. The unified theory says there's actually a way to coherently interrelate those particular threads into a picture that is sensible. We haven't done that yet, but if we do, then the idea of mechanism will certainly blossom out. So I'm not disputing, I'm simply saying the short or long answer is that here's a particular line that has a particular emphasis, but it is not constrained by that way, certainly in the way I would interpret the word mechanism.
Thank you. Thank you. So again, I'm going to go on to another question, though, on account of time. Could you put up slide 22?
Certainly.
Right. Okay. So this figure presents something that Gregg, that you referred to in your overview of the model. But I asked you to put it up so that people could actually see it. To me, this is an interesting presentation of how these systems. I'm especially thinking. My focus right now is especially on the middle column, justification system, defensive system, and the column to its right, cognitive, psychodynamic, experiential, behavioral. It's an interesting observation about how things are often conceptualized in the field. Although I don't want to say there's no novelty to it. I mean, I think there is, Gregg, and you're putting it together. But I know that you're really interested in some brief email exchange that we had shortly after your presidential address in thinking about the relationships between these things. Say the justification system and defensive system, for example. But I'm wondering, I think we can ask questions about this. For example, in interpersonal defense theory, the theory I've developed, the defensive system and the relationship system are completely integrated. And so it goes beyond what you might describe as, oh, there are relationships between these two systems, to saying that they're one system. And I think people from different perspectives could come up with other similar questions about this framework. And so when we set out, I mean, anytime you set out a framework, you're making commitments uh, about these things, that they're worth noting, that they're worth treating one as separate from the other, et cetera. And so I'm just, right now, for the moment, I was just raising the question of, can we get as far as we need to get just by having them here, and then thinking about any more complex processes
Sure.
as involving relationships between them,
Of course.
which still sees them as separate. So, but now, to finish the question, could you please put up slide 14?
Okay.
Yeah. So this is one of the figures from Gregg's presidential address, which includes that reference to mountains and the idea of being able to look over the whole mountain range. And that's the eye in the upper left-hand corner. That is the eye as in I see things with my eye. Yeah. So as I understand it, the unification idea brings with it this perspective that can view the whole range of mountains, symbolized by the eye. But my question is, what is this additional perspective? You have the mountains, and then you have the eye over on the side that looks at it. And so well, in particular, what does this mean when it comes to, say, conceptualizing a case or trying to formulate what might be effective interventions? So, for example, does it mean that certain kinds of intervention approaches might be indicated, or combinations of approaches might be indicated for certain patients? Does it mean that certain interventions would be indicated for certain parts of what a patient is dealing with? Or am I just all wet here? And I mean, but maybe, does it mean something really different? I'm just not sure what it means.
Sure.
Because the eye in that picture is really doing a lot, if it's doing anything at all. It's overviewing and then doing something based on the overview.
Right.
So that's my question.
Good. Yeah. So, I mean, there is a pretty concrete way to represent that eye. That is the collective view that emerged in the summit series on unification in Cape Cod that Jeffrey Magnavita hosted, and then it was attended by me and Andre Marquis and Ken Critchfield and Kristen Osborne and Barbara Ingram and Jack Anshin and a few others intermittently so we went up, I think it was 2015, 2017. The history of it is in 2009, maybe 10, where there was a Baltimore SEPI where we did a panel integration on unification, okay? Where we all sat up and had our 15-minute spiel, through the 75 minutes or whatever. And I think it was Bruce Leese. I'm not really sure. I may be misreplacing him there. But he came in and asked a really important question after we all got up and gave our versions of unification. He was like, unification, I thought it was like a perspective that would be coherent. I came in and listened to each one of you guys, and they're all different. And so now I'm super confused about what unification is. It's not one thing. There are many different unifications that seem to point to many different things. And we couldn't deny that. We had all found what we were calling unified through our totally independent scholarly paths. We weren't doing this as a joint project. We had definitely done it independently. And as the conversations emerged, it was pretty clear that there were three major perspectives. Andre Marquis was bringing the perspective from Ken Wilber's integral theory. Okay, I was bringing my unified theory perspective, and Jeffrey Magnavita and Jack Anshin were bringing their unified view. and they were different views. So at the 2010, you would have 3 to 5 different I's there. Okay. So then the issue was, well, what are these views and how do we get them in relation? And so what the Summit series and a bunch of emails did was that actually, let's be clear on what Jeffrey Magnavita and Jack Anshin are doing. They are doing a biopsychosocial complex adaptive dynamic systems model. Okay, so they're taking general systems theory, they're nesting biology and physics and psychology at a particular level, social, looking at triangles across complex dynamic systems, creating both a hierarchy and a dynamic structure that allows them to see the whole, which I think is a credible way to putting together the mountain range. Andre Marquis, building off of Ken Wilber, in particular Ken Wilber's quadrant system. The quadrant system is really, I don't know if you know Ken Wilber's quadrant system, but basically it divides the world. Ken, as a philosopher, independent, intellectual, spiritual, brilliant thinker, in my estimation, built this entire system called integral theory. That's shortened hand, its description is all qual, which means all quadrants, all lines. I won't talk about lines, but the quadrants refer to the idea that different schools of thought are embedded to and commit to different epistemological frames. Okay, so some frames like humanistic phenomenology, they commit to the legitimacy of subjective inside-out epistemic experience and argue that the core of psychology's got to deal with the organismic valuing process from the inside, and the phenomenological experience of being is absolutely key, for example. So that's an inside individual level perspective. Okay. In contrast, Skinner and the behaviorists were outside individual behavior generally. They were like, we'll see the environmental contingencies. So you get an inside outside. At one level, you get individual inside outside. And then Wilber saw there's also a collective view. Okay. So the collective inside view is actually like a social constructionist, hermeneutic, postmodern, intersubjective view. Actually, what we're doing is we're all getting together, developing shared language systems that make meaning out of the world in a we space sort of way. That's the inside collective view. And there are macroscopic systems perspective that are on the outside, but start with the large scale and move down rather than start with the individual and move up. So you get a collective exterior. Okay, so Wilber argues that if you take a phenomenology interior individual, behavioral exterior individual, collective hermeneutic, socially constructed interior we space, collective interior, and a systems exterior, you can see lots of different epistemological perspectives through this meta-epistemological perspective. Well, Andre Marquis took that view and argued that he's right, basically. He said that we can actually understand humanistic, behavioral, socially constructed systems views as essentially embracing these quadrants. So what he afforded through Wilber is a meta-epistemological view. Me, I came at this from basically, and I didn't even have the language at the time, I developed a meta theory and then realized that actually what I needed was a descriptive metaphysics for an ontology, meaning I had to be able to tell you what we mean by energy, matter, life, mind, and culture. And I actually developed a new framework for descriptive metaphysics for those concepts that then afford a specification about ontology. So when we got together over the time, we realized, it took us a long time, that although we climbed up the mountain, we actually could, through conversation, realize that there's a systemic view on the mountain, there's an meta-epistemological view, and a metaphysical ontological view on the mountain. And that when we talked about it, we could then see that we are definitely seeing the same mountain range. So that view really does represent the efforts of us as meta-theorists, okay? Now, whether that's relevant for the field in terms of a specific practitioner dealing with a specific client, I think that's a very debatable question, okay? That's a totally different question. What I believe it's relevant for is understanding the landscape of psychotherapy, how we teach it, how knowledge is understood in general, what we're doing at the level of academic refined knowledge, and how we actually generate coherent knowledge systems, which I think are absolutely necessary in refined knowers that then spread out into the culture. My critique is that our knowledge systems are chaotic, fragmented, and pluralistic, not just in psychology, but in general. And that's a freaking disaster across multiple domains. And if you can achieve coherence for a big picture, you should, not that you should just submit to it, but if you can actually achieve it in a way that's demonstrably better than a chaotic, fragmented system, develop and cultivate a coherent, integrated, big picture view at the level of a refined academic, not at the level of a layperson or even a therapist with a specific client. That's a whole, the distance between those things is high. And I don't know that they're very relevant. I did a whole You Talking episode with Stephen Bacon, who's a critic about what we know in psychotherapy and what we have not yielded, basically arguing that all of our technical language is essentially, well, it's sophisticated within itself, but it actually doesn't yield any outcome benefit. That's a whole nother set of conversations. But if you believe that empirically, then the argument will go, it doesn't matter from that vantage point. That's not what the I is about. The I is fundamentally a refined academic view that invites us to say that the landscape, mountain landscape, can be seen. We didn't know how to see it at first. We've yoked together various unified views to make them cohere. That's a very valuable thing if it's possible, because if you come in from a zoomed out view that actually has the edges of the puzzle correct, you get a very, very different picture, and one I believe is much, much more useful across a number of different layers, but not necessarily in the immediate pragmatic sense.
Well, that's really clarifying for me, because I just heard the talk and then read through it again as
we did generate a paper on that argument in the Journal of Contemporary Psychotherapy. It came out in 2021.
Yeah, I read that one.
Oh, okay, good.
Okay, but in the context of this talk,
you'd have to. There's definitely a backstory to need to know what the I is.
Right, and in particular, what you said was there's a long distance between that and what a psychotherapist might do with a particular patient. Let me turn now to some questions which are about the part of your talk and the part of your introductory comments that are more, well, very closely linked to clinical practice. And here I'm referring to what you say about internalizing problems and that part of the talk. And so these are things that you said, of course, quickly because of time constraints at the beginning of this Zoom. If I remember right, you referred to this, the application of the whole backstory to the particular but important and prevalent kind of clinical issues that involve internalizing problems. And part of what you say about it is that triple negative neurotic loops play a really important part, which you also referred to in the introductory remarks. Could you put up slide 25? Yeah, that's a good place to leave it. Yeah, thank you. So this is what you present as a maladaptive process that plays a key role in internalizing problems, and I believe you say in maladaptive patterns of adaptation more generally, not totally generally, but more generally than internalizing problems. And so the idea is that negative events lead to negative feelings, and then negative reactions, and those negative reactions are likely to then lead to more negative events, and so on, creating a vicious cycle. This is an interesting idea, to be sure. but it's also one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, more or less this model. And I simply want to say that in the context of my work on interpersonal defense theory, I have arrived at the belief that in order to understand recurring problematic interpersonal patterns, we really can get further if we use a model that not only includes dynamics or processes or phenomena related to these negative aspects of experience, but also centrally include a person's wish, and specifically conflicts between wishes and fears. Wishes and fears, in my case, not viewed as intrapsychic phenomena, but as viewed as what a person is doing or trying to do, right, as that person engages with others. And so I won't spend more than 1 minute to say that in interpersonal defense theory, wishes play a key role along with fears regarding the reaction part. That is, the person doesn't just react negatively, the person actually reacts in a conflicted way, which includes elements of pursuing the wish. And albeit it's dysfunctional, and they lead to outcomes, which in this case would be the negative events, which are just different from and avoid the key negative outcome that a person is most concerned about. And in fact, in addition, include some positive, systematic positive outcomes, albeit not what the person wishes. So now I'm saying all of this, not in that 1 minute, imagining that I'm going to convince anybody, Greg, you or anyone viewing this, that that's how we should see it. But really to make the point that there are other ways of conceptualizing maladaptive patterns, and in this case, cyclical maladaptive patterns. So just to finish this, I want to add a related but distinct notion that in my own practice with patients and in my work on interpersonal defense theory, I've become more and more convinced that wishes are really work with people on their wishes are really important to help them change. That and I'm not necessarily at all attributing this to you in particular, Greg, but I will attribute it to many theories and the way I believe many psychotherapists practice, that if we can clear away the negative processes, then everything will be okay. Right. And in interpersonal defense theory, that idea is viewed as misguided. And coming from a very, very different quarter, I just want to mention that Franz Kaspar, in his plan analysis approach, puts a great deal of emphasis on working with what a patient wishes for or wants. Lovely. And so the point going way back to my first comments is, so here you have an element in the overall view that has value and interest to it without question, but it's a commitment to a particular, it's putting in a particular sort of substantive block in the overall structure. And at the very least, there are other ways to fill that block. And that's the point that I want to make. And that, in fact, that bringing in wishes is really key to, I would say, making possible corrective emotional experiences. Corrective emotional experiences are not primarily the not occurring of negative emotional experiences. So that's a set of comments, which I think has a question in it. So I would welcome your response.
Well, it's a great question and a very important one. And I want to be clear that so this is a particular angling on a particular epicenter through a particular set of lines that is not deemed as sort of unified. Does not mean absolute, foundational, and done. Unified means that their current, certainly the way I use the term, it's from E.O. Wilson's consilience, and it means it's a fun qualitative shift from an incoherent structure of understanding, looking at the refined landscape, to one that actually can cohere. So that it doesn't mean, and then once it coheres, it looks quite different. That's all that it really means. And it doesn't then mean, oh, well, now you have this unified view, you know everything. It means you're just not clueless. You're less clueless. That's all it really means. Okay. And basically, if we can't define the basic ontology of the science, it means we're really clueless. I think I'm a little less clueless. Okay. So that's the context. And so therefore, the idea that this is a narrow view that misses key aspects of human psyche, psychic functioning for therapy and other kinds of things, I'm totally open to that. I'm throwing this out there and inviting people. And if they say actually, and then I'm like, and your point is super well taken. Positive affectivity in general, wish fear complexes, central. I see those as central. I also want to say that I see, I'm talking about mostly individual level process, but I'm a deeply relational thinker. Okay. So the context here is individual psychotherapy, sort of what I would say is the epicenter of the problem, and a clear kind of pathway in that's both commonsensical, usable, and broad, but no way is it the final way, and maybe they're missing key points. One key point that's very clear, like I don't talk about systems theory, and I don't talk about interpersonal theory. I don't know how clearly I put this, but when I'm teaching my class, I'm like, hey, there's a level of analysis that I'm engaged in, and I'm now operative. The entity and pattern formation that I'm dealing with is the individual, which of course then lives in a micro-relational context, and a meso-relational context, and a macro-relational context. And those are totally legitimate spots to intervene and to understand. The influence matrix, which basically tracks our primate experience of being in the social world, basically says we're internal working models are these networks of self-other experience that are then formed through attachment, and then through friendships, and then through broken enemies and betrayals and lovers, etc. And then we live in an the richness of what we deal with in psychotherapy is a psychosocial relational world. The idea that we are navigating interpersonal processes and that's what we are regulating, is very, very consistent with the unified view. Okay. The entire view of justification, the justification theory, emerges as the idea that propositional language in a culture set the stage for other people to ask you why you're doing what you're doing. And it lived as an intersubjective highway between people. And it said that the most fundamental thing is your relational value and social influence inside this network of connection. So it creates a very, very relational model. And the idea that defense and relationship are, I wouldn't say they're fused, and I could talk about why, but the fundamental reason we have defense, what I call the Freudian filter, is because we have to maintain a public justified position and an egoic justified position in a world of relation and judgment and engagement. And how we manage that is where the central dynamic is of the defensive system, how we manage our place in the relational world. So certainly right away, I would say, hey, man, I think I can differentiate. I have my reasons. But if you say, actually, these two things are fused, especially if you take the interpersonal level of analysis as your unit, I'm going to watch the self-other exchanges in the world over time and utilize that. Well, then, yeah, That to me, so the first thing I would say is I think our object of analysis may be slightly different. I would argue that interpersonal theories, dyadic and triadic, this is actually something that Jeffrey Magdavita and Jack Enkin talk about, dyadic and triadic are different than intrapsychic, individual. They, of course, live in nested real world systems, so they're always iteratively interacting, but you can shine the light in particular ways with utility on particular levels or dimensions of analysis, and that's the point. So my return back to you is I think that sounds like a really interesting set of observations. I'd be totally open to that. This thing invites a particular angle. Don't hear unified as the angle. It just means that there's a coherent big picture view that does change the game. Now we can actually maybe network the key insights together. I'm certainly open to the idea that I'm missing key insights. I will certainly say that I'm underdeveloped on family systems views. I'm underdeveloped on, economic views. I'm underdeveloped on a lot of different views, and I need expertise. And so somebody that's attended carefully to the patterns of interpersonal process, recognize the dynamics of wish in these patterns would bring a very, very powerful insight that is undoubtedly underdeveloped from where I'm coming.
Well, thank you. And so my last questions, there are two, I think, actually, in this. You anticipated, I think, your answer to what you're going to say about it, but I think it'll be helpful to me for sure, and to viewers quite possibly, for me to go ahead and staying on the more clinical level. Could you first show slide 31, please?
31.
31, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I just want to briefly point out that this is Gregg's view of the before and after of successful treatment of someone dealing with internalizing problems. The left side is the before, and he mentioned those problems in his opening remarks. And then the right side is where they get to, which in the title is called CALM. And you can see that that's an acronym for the first letters of the 4 points on the right side. I mean, I think it's quite clearly presented there. And then if you would go to slide 32, the next one. Yeah, with all 6 points up. So this is what you suggest as the steps towards getting from the left side of that previous figure to the right. And I'd like to ask everyone just to take a moment to read through the 6. Okay, I hope I've given enough time. But the first point I want to make about this, at least as I see it, is that it seems to me that this particular treatment approach outlined here is a very top-down, very cognitive approach, not exclusively because of role plays and practice in different situations, but that's the way it strikes me. So that's the first point.
Okay, that's reasonable.
Yeah, let me just add to that, Gregg.
Okay.
So, I mean, lots of people coming from different directions would probably, well, I think a lot of people would read this and say, hey, this is really interesting. And I'm actually one of them. I want to say to you, Gregg, this is interesting. I mean, it seems like a helpful picture to keep in mind that I've already begun to think about in connection with one of my patients, actually, and how it might be useful in my work with that person. But people coming from other perspectives would say, well, but couldn't you deal with it this way, or I would deal with it that way? And I want to say that I certainly think when I think about it being top down, the main thing I think about is that there's very little, perhaps none, actual explicit mention of the therapeutic relationship here. There is mention in the whole talk, and Gregg has mentioned a number of times thinking about the relationship, and Marv Goldfried's and Catherine Eubanks' idea of facilitating the alliance. But I want to make a somewhat independent point, but it's related to a different way of thinking about this, about how to help a person with these problems. The therapeutic relationship, the alliance in particular, is often thought of as a foundation for therapeutic work. And it often serves that function. And there's some considerable amount of data which support that idea, that it's sort of like if the union and the employees, the union and the CEO, et cetera, are in a stalemate about a contract negotiation. Maybe if they all go out to the golf course and have a round or two. I say that as someone who doesn't play golf at all, doesn't find that very appealing. But anyway, and it's certainly an old boys kind of metaphor, so excuse me. But if they do that, then they can come back the next day to the negotiating table and get somewhere. And that's probably true. I mean, it doesn't have to be golf. They could just hang out and talk about things other than the contract, and that might do it. And I think that way of viewing the alliance has some real validity in terms of how it often does function. But you can also think about the therapeutic relationship as itself a venue for helping a person move to change in the relationship.
Totally. Mm-hmm.
And that then through generalizing that, what's happening in the therapeutic relationship can make for a difference. So we see this in traditional notions of transference work, where a lot of insight-oriented work focuses on the transference.
Sure.
And which makes it different than focusing on someone talking about, only talking about, or instead talking about their relationship, say, with their boss, because there's an immediacy to talking about the transference work. But there are also more active ways of thinking about how the therapeutic relationship can make a difference. And here I'll give a couple of examples. One, Brent Mallinckrodt, who's done a lot of work trying to think of the implications of attachment theory for psychotherapy, has suggested that you can think about the emotional, psychological, social distance between patient and therapist as what he calls therapeutic distance. And that differentially, for people who are primarily avoidant in their attachment style versus people who are anxious ambivalent in their attachment style, the therapist should deal with therapeutic distance actually in opposite ways.
Sure.
Over time to help them. And that is not primarily at all in Brent's model what one is talking about or teaching or explaining or understanding. but it's how you're relating to the patient.
Totally.
Similarly, work that goes back to our now lost colleague, Jeremy Safran, Chris Moran, and Catherine Eubanks again on ruptures and resolutions, can be thought of as how to just get the alliance out of, from being out of whack into whack.
Sure.
So it can be a good foundation, but the psychologists I just named think of it mostly in a very different way, which is this idea of actually being an online way of facilitating change in the therapeutic relationship by how the therapist relates to the patient,
sure,
and that can be therapeutic. I'll just note that the idea of this sort of relationship level of intervention in the Therapeutic Alliance is one, but not the only idea that certainly emerges from interpersonal defense theory. And in particular, it involves realizing in particular ways, in certain circumstances, realizing the person's central interpersonal wish in the therapeutic relationship by how the therapist relates to the patient. So again, the point here is that there are other ways of proceeding. That I'm pointing out that this model, I'm pointing at my screen, so it's the
totally, yeah, no, I'm following.
It's the 6 points. It strikes me as a top-down model. That one alternative would be actually different ways, different ways of employing the therapeutic relationship as a key vehicle of change, or I think quite applicable in many, many cases of people dealing with interpersonal problems. But that there are other ways of proceeding too. And so that's my last question. Okay.
Well, I think the short answer response that I'll give is that I don't really disagree with any of that. The only issue really is what perhaps I should have done better is just contextualize how I place COM-MO in sort of the pantheon of sort of psychotherapeutic work, our culture, etc. So for example, basically, I think our culture has fundamentally dysfunctional beliefs and relational patterns and processes around negative feeling, negative relations. I think that to the extent that we would generalize this as a psychoeducational model in classrooms, in families, and in schools. Okay. Well, this is extracting out of the common core wisdom of psychotherapy relative to anxiety, low self-esteem, relational sensitivity, and says, hey, you're going to get all jacked up. And here's a way to understand that. Now, the reason you're getting jacked up almost always is a function of the interpersonal dances across time, both real and interjected and transferred in the world. Okay, so that's an unbelievably crucial. It's an interpersonal angle. Okay, that I'm not exactly emphasizing, and so again, I maybe glossed over it. But the idea, I mean, when I do the key ingredients of good therapy, the first thing I say is the Therapeutic Alliance. Okay, and then I define it in Borden's old terms of, hey, do you like and trust the person? You have high, good relational quality, good flow in the therapy room. Do they share with you a felt sense of being in the world that helps you make sense out of yourself, either bottom up or top down? Do they motivate you towards particular kinds of interventions? And do you kind of track the change process in a way that would be hoped for based on some sense of prognosis and give feedback in case there's ruptures, repairs, or a distancing relative to what would be expected? So the inside the therapy, if you want to understand therapy as a particular kind of interpersonal process, absolutely. And so all of that. And then the process by which an individual, the influence matrix emphasizes your felt sense of relational value and social influence. Okay, so you go in and are you respected by the therapist? Do they see, know, and value you? both at the conscious level and then through the subconscious. Say if you're avoidant attachment style, of course you don't know that, but if you pull away through counter-dependent process, and then there's a bit of a rupture, the therapist better be tracking exactly whether this person's going to be in a counter-dependent move away structure or a hyper-dependent move towards structure. And if you're going to give a corrective relational experience to that process, the therapist better be able to dance on both of those different kinds of tunes. So I certainly would agree with that. I especially think it's very relevant in some of the work you and Ken and other people do with personality disorders, okay, with individuals that have essentially their relational systems are poorly integrated, they're fractured, they flip, they get extreme, they get rigid. The justification identity system in relationship to both real world and past is, filled with chaos. And the idea that you could enter that as a therapy, become a good enough object for a reference point that the individual could trust and afford an attachment honing structure that is all nonverbal. That's all at the level of the primate felt experience of being seen, known, and valued in the world in a particular way that affords a recalibration of the internal working models that are, again, not through justification, but through the felt sense of the pictorial, affective, image-based way of being a world as a primate. Those are all things that I embrace. It just isn't, it's not just developed in this particular context where I'm saying, hey, here's a common core idea for us in general that's top down, so psychoeducational, totally. Really, it's, I mean, you can ask, well, what's a good therapist do? I would argue that a good therapist affords psychological mindfulness and reflectivity. Good therapist is calm. Good therapist is curious, accepting, and loving, and motivated toward valued states of being. I would argue that at a basic level, the interpersonal context, if it wasn't any of those things, or even if it wasn't even all of them, it probably wouldn't be I think therapists tend to embody this, and I think it's healing precisely because in the implicit relational world, this creates an opportunity to cohere affect and attachment structures in a more healthy and adaptive way, rather than replaying old patterns of gift of love patterns, if you use IRT or any other number of kinds of structures. So the bottom line is, I think the issue is, and we should wrap up here, but I think the fundamental issue is basically there's limitations of perspective that maybe I didn't qualify enough in relationship to clarifying the line of thought that I'm advocating for, which really is, hey, we have LUV and the therapy and common factors. Actually, we should have COM-MO too. It's just sort of basic common sense. Don't be critical, closed, rigid, irritable, tense, insistent. Be curious, accepting, loving, especially when you hit a negative feeling, negative situation, relation, or especially when you start yourself feeling trapped. So these are actually really general principles, and it applies as much to societies, couples, schools, as it does to the therapy room.
Thank you for that response and for this whole exchange.
I really enjoyed it. You bring a very important and interesting and deep perspective, Michael, and I appreciate you taking the time to be a discussant for this talk.
My pleasure. Yeah, and once again, thank you, Greg. Thanks very much.
Well, we'll put this up. I'll shoot you an email, see if there's any links you want to add to it, and then when we're ready, we'll share it with the SEPI listserv. Okay.
Great. Okay. So should I mention now